Thanks everybody for joining today. Welcome to the inaugural FoxPoint Solutions Cybersecurity Webinar Series. I'm Charlie Wood, co-founder, practice leader of FoxPoint Solutions. Over the course of the next 5 days, we've got a lot of interesting content that we're going to be talking about. We hope you find it informative and interesting. Today, Chris is going to talk about cybersecurity threats, challenges, and what to do. But throughout the week, we have an 11 o'clock and a 2 o'clock session. Today is the one day that we're only going to have an 11 o'clock session. Tomorrow, we've got the executive digital footprinting, followed by how to protect yourself and loved ones from cybercrime. Wednesday, we're going to talk eCISO, and we have one of our channel partners, Patron Risk. They're going to talk about their risk vault solution, which helps organizations identify and mitigate security risk. On Thursday, we have Fraud Finder presentation, a very lightweight tool that helps organizations as well as individuals identify fraud, followed by fast tracking the SOC 2. And then Friday is a big day for us. It is we're going to talk about what every executive and board member should know about IT. But the most exciting part for me is the cybersecurity and artificial intelligence presentation at 2 o'clock. That is exciting to me because a lot of our customers are asking us on a regular basis, what do I do with AI and how is this going to impact me or my organization going forward? So that'll be the last presentation on Friday. So we want this to be interactive. Please use the chat function as Chris is talking. If you have questions. In addition to that, this is our inaugural webinar series. So if you have anything that you want relative to a future topic, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to put something together in the future if it's something of interest to the collective. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Salone. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Charlie, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with us in this inaugural first session. Like Charlie mentioned, we were going to do a part 1 and part 2 of top threats, challenges, and what to do about them today. But unfortunately, due to some last-minute scheduling conflicts, we had to cancel that second session, and we're just going to do sort of a combined presentation for today. So if you were looking forward to attending both sessions, not to worry. We're going to cover a lot of both of those topics right here in this session. And also, a lot of the subsequent sessions that are going to be going on throughout the week, we'll cover a lot of topics more in depth that Dom and I are going to cover this morning. So with that said, we're here to talk about what are we seeing in the industry, a little bit of a taste of a palate wetting of cyber topics, challenges, and what we're seeing. I'm Christopher Salone. I am a principal here at FoxPoint Solutions, and I have co-presenting with me the newest member of FoxPoint, Dom. He joined us from RIT just a few months ago, and we got a good session for you today. We want to be cognizant of your time, so we'll jump right in to our agenda for this morning. So what we're going to cover, the bulk of today's sessions is going to be current trends in cyber and AI. We're going to talk at a high level, some statistics, some trends, what's happening, what's new, what's not new, but is still present. A lot of those will not be surprising to you, but it's still important to talk about them to let you know what our clients are dealing with, what people in the industry are telling us about, and also some things that are happening right here to us in the firm. We have some fun examples to show you and walk through. Then we'll talk a little bit about, hey, what are key compliance challenges, right? Remember, you might be in a highly regulated space, you're doing an audit for the first time, you have a regulator in the door, or you're just trying to figure out where your gaps are. We wanted to highlight some of the major pain points that a lot of organizations that we talk to are dealing with today. And then we're going to kind of conclude today's session with some questions to take home with you. If there's certain pain points, topics that you wanted to talk to your management team or your colleagues about, I think we have kind of summed up some of them for you that might be helpful to kind of start a conversation. As always, as we're going through, please feel free to leave questions in the chat. We will get to them. All right, so let's dive right in. So, with current trends in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, like I mentioned, a lot of these topics that we're going to highlight will be covered in more detail later in the week. But here's just a little bit at a high level, what we're seeing in the industry. And I would be remiss if we did not start with ransomware. Now, listen, we've been talking about ransomware for a long time now. This slide has gone through many iterations, but has made its way into these presentations for a couple of years now. And I'd love to remove it. I'd love to stop talking about it. But the reality is ransomware isn't going away. Matter of fact, the total number of ransomware incidents increased again last year. I'm sure when the 2025 final numbers come out, my fingers are crossed right here that we can kind of have more positive, trends to report on. But as of 2024, the number of attacks continues to go up, and that's not surprising, right? The more we connect and the more we digitalize our organizations, the more risk we present, and that kind of is reflected in the number of attacks. I do think this third bullet point here is a little bit of reprieve, and it's not all doom and gloom, right? And I thought it was an interesting one as I was doing some research for this presentation. It says in 2024, 49% of ransomware attacks resulted in data encryption, which is a significant drop from the prior year. And so what this is saying is that organizations and our IT teams and our security teams are doing a better job of locking down our data. So even if somebody does gain unauthorized access, which is how all ransomware usually starts and is initiated, they're having a harder time actually getting to our crown jewels and extracting data and encrypting it and forcing us to make a decision of paying or not paying. And so I would say a drop from 81% to 49% is a fantastic statistic to read, and I hope that that trend continues in the future. However, the cost of a full-on data breach and when ransomware does occur, approaching close to $10 million is catastrophic for many organizations. So reporting on this and increasing the security tools that we have in place is uh, imperative. Some of the data will not be recovered in the event of a cybersecurity attack. That's not new. But what is kind of interesting is seeing the shift in what is considered guidance on how to deal with a ransomware attack if it does occur. In the past, right, the conventional wisdom was let's pay, let's get this out of here, let's get our data back, let's not, have a situation extend longer than it needs to be. But now, given the tools and security protocols that we are expected to have in place from regulators, from, laws and agencies, it is now the expectation that we do not pay. And if we do pay, we might be facing additional fines for extortion, for aiding in sometimes terrorism, cyber terrorism, as the FBI likes to coin that term. So it's an interesting kind of shift in the dynamic of how to deal with ransomware and sort of the lose-lose situations that a lot of organizations can find themselves in the unfortunate instance of ransomware. So some of those controls that you're expected to have in place will cover, but backups, for example, and encryption, like we just mentioned, are two of the most, reactive controls that you can have in place to deal with an active ransomware threat. And then lastly, kind of highlighting how ransomware has changed and evolved over time is this concept that we're seeing recently called malvertising, where if your internet browsers, if your IT tools and configurations are not sort of strong enough, sometimes a ad can pop up that has malicious code embedded behind it that can automatically launch itself. So if you are not using a proper ad blocker, for example, and you just visit a website, you're not technically doing anything wrong, and an ad pops up, if it was embedded with malicious code, sometimes ransomware or that malware can be launched automatically without you even clicking on anything, which is quite scary, right? In the past, it was hey, don't click on that banner over there. Don't click on that Black Friday sale. And we've been trained to avoid those, but sometimes cyber attacks can be launched even if we are staying on top of our toes. So let's talk about another one that isn't going away and continues to evolve over time. Of course, we're talking about account takeovers and phishing. Billions of email phishes are sent on a given day, which is an insane and unfathomable number to wrap your heads around. And it can kind of illustrate why and how some things eventually and sometimes slip through the cracks. And how that happens and why it happens is because people make mistakes. And it is still the number one way a cyber attack happens or starts is because somebody made a mistake or an error along the way. They clicked on something that they weren't supposed to, or something was misconfigured, or they were fooled into submitting their credentials. It is still an ongoing issue. And the reason it's hard to keep up with is because the attacks and the fish emails or the texts or the phone calls that we're going to get into are increasingly difficult to pick up on. Hackers are just as smart as us at crafting a ruse, and we wanted to illustrate a very, very simple example of how this kind of happens on a day-to-day basis. And this is an example that happened to me. I got this actual email directly to my inbox that illustrates, how this happens. And usually it starts with some simple reconnaissance. A hacker will have a target in mind and look up some publicly available information or sometimes information that they might have access to on the dark web. In this instance, maybe they go to a simple LinkedIn profile. So my LinkedIn profile is publicly available and is up to date. So someone could go right there, figure out my name. They could figure out where I went to college. They know where I work, and they could start there and they could kind of craft some messages from there about where I work, where I went to school, the type of work that I might be engaged in to try and trick me and to try to kind of knock me off of my toes. Then they could kind of figure out my contact information. And I was curious myself. I was thinking, hey, how simple is it for someone to find out my email address and to send me something? Well, it turns out, AI, Google can help somebody in a split second. They want to know what my email address is, just go ahead and type it. It's right there, pops up for someone to take and use and craft something. And so what that ends up looking like is something like this, right? Someone crafts an email that comes directly to my inbox. This is an actual example of an email that I got claiming to be from my company, Bonadio. Hey, we need you to acknowledge something. We need to have you log in so you can review. And if you don't, there will be consequences, right? A very, very common recurring theme when you get a message like this. Somebody is asking you to log in, somebody's asking you to help out, and is threatening you if you don't comply. But this is tricky, right? It's quite possible that I do have some policies that I need to take a look at. And I need to sign in to do so. So this could be an instance where someone could be fooled reasonably. But as always, there are some signs and there are some red flags that we always need to be looking out for when we get these messages. The first one, the most obvious one, is the banner on top of the email saying that this is coming from outside of my organization. That should be the number one telling sign that this isn't actually coming from Bonadio. This is coming from outside of Bonadio. So there's always something in the email, among others, that we can look for that can kind of tell us this is a scam. We need to take a step back. We need to figure out why I'm getting this and figure out what to do from here. From here, report this to our IT teams that can confirm that it was a scam and they can quarantine this email for me on my behalf. So some other ways that we get phishing emails is in the form of text messages, right? How many of us get a text message like this that comes right to our phones, right? And sometimes these can be difficult to pick up on and tricky because they always seem a little bit more personal, right? how did somebody get my actual cell phone number? And me, you know what? I was driving on the throughway just yesterday or a couple days ago. So yeah, I would expect I have some tolls to pay. Maybe I missed my Easy Pass and I gotta go online and pay it. I get them in the mail sometimes, so maybe they are actually sending me something via text message. So these are tricky. But just like the email exchange that we just went through, you always have to stop and think about why you're getting a certain message or another way to verify the validity of the information or the message that you're getting. So in the case of the Easy Pass, if I really did have some tolls that I had to pay, I'm likely going to get an envelope in the mail, or I could go on the Easy Pass website and double check this information right here. Credit card is an interesting one, right? I get texts about my credit card information all the time. Sometimes they're legit, sometimes they're fake, like this one in the middle here. You could always just log on to your app to double check if you had an alert. Probably going to get an email as well. But these are, ever present. They are just as, frequent, I find, as the email scams. And sometimes these are difficult to stop from coming through because our phones don't have spam filters that are as effective as our current email spam filters. So these types of messages come directly to your phone without being screened. So sometimes if they find the right person and they're tricky enough, they can really trip you up. So now let's move over to Dom. He's got another good example for us.
Yes, I did want to add one thing about the phishing as well. Another thing that we're seeing in the industry is something called push bombing. So push bombing is pretty similar to phishing in the sense that, let's just say for your organization, you might have MFA enabled through let's just say Authenticator, or you get a six-digit code similar to what you saw on the last slide, where you get a six-digit code to verify your identity. What attackers are doing is they are sending multiple requests. So let's just say your credentials were hacked through a phish, through your email. Now they have your username and password. You have MFA enabled. Well, how are they going to get past that? What they're doing is they're spamming your inbox or spamming your text message, or spamming your authenticator app on your phone, such as Duo, Microsoft Authenticator. And they're saying, hey, I'm going to frustrate the heck out of this person until they click accept. And then that's how they gain access. Um, a good way to prevent that is to making sure that you're actually logging in. And so if you get a authenticator notification on your mobile device that is untimed, such as you not logging in, or it's at 8 p.m., or you see the location. So a lot of times when you're using something like Duo, it'll show you which location that device is logging in from. If it's not from where you're currently at, that's a clear telltale sign that that's obviously some sort of smishing or push bombing attack. So moving on to a different type of phishing here, vishing, which happens to do with voice phishing. Pretty common, especially with the emergence of artificial intelligence that's able to mimic human voices and mimic human mannerisms in voice. So Chris is going to play an audio for what the original audio might sound like that you might think, hey, I'm never going to fall for this one. So you might get that call and say, "Hey, I don't think I'm ever going to get a call from the IRS talking about my account in that tone from an automated system." Well, let's see what happens. So what you can do, and what attackers might do, is they might take this message and take the script and plug it into, let's just say this is from ChatGPT, and ChatGPT can spit out a new script that sounds a lot more human-like and what sounds more like something you might actually get from an organization such as the IRS. And then what you can do is you can plug this script, and actually this is completely free. So somebody can actually use these tools that are pictured here and do this for no charge, um, and very easy to use. And they can plug the script into a different tool, which will spit out the actual MP3 file and audio. And then they can attack the same person with the same information with this new audio. So now you're talking about common targeted audiences that might be subject to this. This can be a very powerful tool for attackers to use in tool vision. Another common cybersecurity trend and threat we're seeing is the emergence of quantum computing. Now, this really hasn't really hit the modern workplace yet, but it's definitely something coming up within the decade. So, quantum computing is a new kind of computing that uses strange and powerful rules of physics that I'm sure myself and many other people cannot understand yet, to solve problems much faster. And when we say much faster, we mean billions of times faster than our average day computers can. So quantum computing uses qubits, which are much more powerful and much more resilient to protections than our classical computing uses using zeros and ones. So how does this present a risk to us? Well, future quantum computers can break most public key encryption. So anything currently, so most computers nowadays are encrypted with 256-bit encryption. Quantum computers can break this very quickly. So what might take a modern computer like a supercomputer now that's in practice, tens of thousands of years can now be cracked within a few years or even a few months using these new quantum computers. One problem that I saw recently, it was a math optimization problem of how to fold a cardboard box with certain dimensions for optimization of how much volume it can take. So taking, let's just say, a 4-inch by 4-inch box, how could you fold that up to make the most volume? It took a computer, a normal, let's just say our normal Windows 11 computer, they estimated about 30,000 years, and it took the quantum computer 200 seconds to compute that same problem. So definitely a lot to worry about. Another problem we're seeing with quantum computing is, obviously some of the quantum technology has not caught up yet with modern encryption. So what adversaries are doing are stealing encrypted data and housing it, and then waiting for the technology to come out. So they're stealing encrypted data. Let's just say it's encrypted with AES 256, and they're waiting for quantum tech to catch up, and then they're going to decrypt it once that quantum tech catches up. And then obviously there's just no regulation and no current standing on quantum yet. So unfortunately, when it comes around, if there's no urgency or discussion around it, it could just kind of bite you in the butt and come up on you pretty quickly. So to sort of mitigate this and talk about this, NIST has released some new encryption standards that will be able to beat post-quantum attacks, and they'll be able to be resistant to quantum computing. And then obviously, the struggle with transitioning into quantum could take anywhere from 5 to 20 years, especially tougher for smaller institutions with less resources. So the hope is that quantum computing moves slow enough where people can transition to, let's just say, modern encryption standards that NIST has released to be resistant to quantum computing. Just a quick sidebar, here at Bonadil, our headquarters is headquartered in Rochester, New York. Quantum computing has had a major head in Rochester, so just a quick side piece. Rochester, New York is known as one of the main founding towns of quantum computing. A lot of big optics companies were out of Rochester, especially on the east side. And U of R and RIT, go Tigers, have something called RockNet. So I actually did a small presentation on this at school. It's an experimental quantum computing network that runs over 11 miles around the Henrietta area, and it actually operates at room temperature. So most quantum computers now have to actually run at sub-zero temperatures. This 11-mile fiber optic network that runs on quantum is able to operate at room temperature. So just a nice side to say, hey, we're making it. There's a ton of headway here, and there is some concern here when it comes to cybersecurity.
Thanks, Tom. That's good stuff. And sure, go Tigers, but also go Cardinals. Um, so we also wanted to talk a little bit about digital assets in crypto because of how quickly things change and how much development and movement is happening in this space, what seems like day after day. With the release and sort of the acceptance of stablecoin, of course, is a lot different than Bitcoin because of, its ability to be tied to, a backed asset like the dollar or gold allows for more organizations, large and small, to sort of get their feet in the game. There's less risk with stablecoin. So there's more acceptance and approval from regulators. Like in the banking space, for example, the FDIC has formally, you know, approved crypto related activities, provided they manage their risks appropriately. And now there has also been a major piece of legislation packed called the Genius Act, which has, provided the first major federal framework for managing, stable coin activities and the risks associated with them. So a lot of clients and customers might be engaging in these activities more frequently than they did in the past and with more, traditional organizations. And what that does is, presents more cyber risks. Um, People, groups always are going to target something that is, you know, easy to sort of go off the hook with, and cryptocurrency and digital assets provide that avenue for them. So if, banks, credit unions, mom and pop shops engage in financial, crypto activities, they might find themselves, a new target for cybercrime that they didn't kind of face, in the past. Coinbase, for example, is a major cryptocurrency firm. They got hit with a cyber attack, upwards of $400 million earlier this year. Just kind of goes to show, when you are publicly kind of touting that you're engaging in crypto activities, you kind of now have another target on your back that you need to kind of stay on top of. Another thing to kind of mention is, this current administration in the government is very pro crypto, is very, pro digital currency. So there's a lot of fast moving parts here. And the quicker things move, sometimes, cyber attacks kind of follow suit with that. That's why the Genius Act has been passed, which I think is a good thing. Um, Hopefully, it will give people more confidence to enter the space safely. But it remains to be seen kind of where this is going to go from here. We also need to talk about geopolitical threats as it relates to cybersecurity. I thought it was quite illuminating last year when the presidential administrations kind of switched again. The outgoing FBI director, his name was Christopher Wray, publicly stated that the largest threat facing this current presidential administration is foreign cybersecurity attacks. Straight up, that's the quote that he said. And to kind of lay that out there, with, I don't know, everything else going on, is quite you know jarring. And so we are seeing that kind of, happen in real time. Every kind of major headline that you see related to cybersecurity attacks, there's like a 50% chance that that's coming from, a foreign, organization or a foreign hacking group. The CISA, the critical infrastructure, has said the same thing, that foreign attacks are a big deal. And at the state level here in New York State, the Department of Financial Services released a formal industry letter earlier this year, kind of acknowledging the same thing, that foreign cybersecurity attacks are a real thing, and we need to really, really stay on top of our risks relating to this. And how it really is kind of, showing up here in the United States is critical infrastructure that hasn't been heavily regulated in the past. For example, a lot of Bitcoin and mining facilities are popping up here in the United States, right? There's a couple here in New York State. Every time that they pop up, they make major headlines. But a good example is there was one that was built in Wyoming 2 years ago that was near a military base. And the Biden administration did not like this at all. They were suspicious that there was some, espionage going on and some foreign spying going on here, so that they ordered it to be shut down completely. They didn't even have any concrete evidence that something malicious was going on or that there was hacking involved, but they didn't like it. They thought it was built too close to a U.S. military base, so they ordered it to be shut down. Just kind of re-illustrates the rising tensions here as it's related to foreign cyber activities. One of the major groups that is involved is called Volt Typhoon, and they use what's called living off the land technique to kind of conduct reconnaissance. They find a way in, they sit and they remain undetected by exploiting these four control areas below, patching, multi-factor authentication, logging, and end-of-life management, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then they kind of learn a little bit, they wait for their time to sort of launch, and then they kind of wreak havoc. It's a tried and true method that we have seen time and time again that foreign cybersecurity groups are launching here in the United States. And related to that, I think, supply chain risks that Dom is going to cover.
Yeah, so I think we all remember what happened with CrowdStrike last year. So that's a perfect example of a supply chain risk having to do with third-party risk management. It's very common for adversaries, if they can't get directly into your organization, to target your vendors and to target people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, this might not happen because of the size of the organization, but Bonadeo here is an M365 environment. We use Outlook, we use SharePoint for our file shares. So, if an organization could not get into Bonadeo directly by, let's just say, trying to phish somebody at the organization, they might target Microsoft and they might try to target their organization in order to try to gain access to our systems. A perfect example of this is organizations using third-party vendors in a physical sense of targeting their food vendors. So there was an instance last year I saw on the news where a presidential dinner was targeted via the vendor that was used for their food. And that's a perfect example of just targeting third-party risk, even not at the technical level. According to a study by the Ponemon Institute, 54% of breaches in total within the past 12 months having to do with 2024 were caused by third parties and not having the correct third-party practices in place. And a study from polling from a bunch of different organizations showed that only about a third of organizations are comfortable in their third parties and their abilities to avoid breaches. So that goes to show, hey, some organizations are still using vendors that, hey, they're not comfortable with, or they're just not comfortable with their third party standing. And another report shows that less than half of organizations regularly review their third parties and their controls. So here at Foxpoint, we talk to clients a lot about third-party risk management and making sure that they're asking the right questions, making sure that their vendors are following the best standards, the best industry standards. And a nice way to assure risk there is to get, let's just say, a SOC 2 report done to get making sure that their vendors are getting the right controls in place. Now to get a little bit into everybody's favorite topic of the day, artificial intelligence. We're seeing more and more of this. We're even seeing just changes by the day. You know, one week you're seeing one trend on social media about it. The next week it's another trend. The increase of utilization obviously just brings a ton of new risk. As we become more reliant on AI, and obviously everybody has different opinions of whether that's a good or bad thing, everybody can kind of agree that information privacy, information security, all these new risks have just heightened as a result of introduction of generative and agentic AI. A nice, easy way for an organization to just start the conversation about this, regulate it, have a basic understanding about it, is to have a policy. Whether that policy is that, hey, we're not ready for it yet, we're just going to prohibit it. You know, we're going to prohibit it at the technical level, not allow users to go on our enterprise network using artificial intelligence tools such as ChatGPT or Copilot, or that we're having an open discussion about it, we're going to allow our users to have an enterprise version. Just having some sort of policy and procedure in place is super important. Having this policy discuss the fact that, you know, no sensitive data should be shared with OpenAI tools, because OpenAI tools digest all information, and organizations such as OpenAI, which developed ChatGPT, do not have legal ramifications in terms of information sharing. They don't have protections in place that a private third party might. They can, your information, your sensitive information could be shared with the wrong parties. Within that policy, it's also important to define its business use. So I know, you know, it might be tempting to say, hey, my direct competitor is using AI and maybe my business is falling behind a little bit. Let's just jump right into it, get into it. But is there a use for it? Is there a current use that we have to actually use it for? It's important also within the data classification side to classify AI generated content as such. That can avoid a lot of legal problems as well as misinterpretations, disinformation, misinformation, etc. And then, as I touched on in the last slide, having to do with supply chain risk, another thing that we've encouraged some of our clients to do is when talking to their third parties, whether that's prior to the engagement, during the engagement, and annual due diligence, is to talk about artificial intelligence and their use. What protections do they have in place? Have they benchmarked against any risk management frameworks regarding AI? What is their organizational policy? A common thing that we say is, hey, just grab their artificial intelligence policy or ask them a question. How do they use it? How do they protect against it?
Yeah, Dom, that's well said. Dom and I actually did a AI focused presentation, and there is one later in the week too that is going to kind of go into some of these bullet points in more detail. But I think the vendor one is really, really big right now. A lot of people in the audience that we did the AI presentation on really wanted to like know, how do I talk to my vendors about AI? And I think updating your contracts, giving yourself sort of some leverage to legally gain an understanding of how your vendors are using AI is going to become increasingly important as this technology develops. So I think that was really well said.
And then just a common way that AI is used in a current trend is just general chatbots. So people can use these on their phones, people can use these on their computers. They're openly available on a common browser like Google. You can just search up chatgpt.com, open up ChatGPT 5.0 or 4.0, and just have a conversation. That wasn't even possible 3 years ago, so it just goes to show how long we've come with these things. Copilot has an enterprise version, so some organizations you're able to chat within your enterprise environment with a Copilot that's able to pull files from your SharePoint or your Dropbox or something similar.
Yeah, I think as it relates to the chatbots, there's a lot of regulatory um, guidance coming. It's not there yet, but I think that there is a big, big push for regulators. We kind of touched on this last week, but the FTC has launched like a major federal inquiry into sort of the major technology providers in the space, like OpenAI and Google and Adobe, for example, seeking to understand how their chatbots work. Like we need to be able to understand specifically as it relates to like people disclosing sensitive information about themselves or their loved ones into a chat bot. Hey, like what are we going to do about that here? Right? I'm sure some of you on this call have seen major headlines about like people using chatbots as like therapy or like disclosing really, really, sensitive information about themselves to the chatbots. So regulators like the FTC are kind of approaching a point of like, okay, we need to do something about this. So I would imagine in subsequent presentations, subsequent years, there's going to be a lot of change going on in the AI regulatory space in that regard.
Also well said. So one thing that we wanted to point out is what would be a use of what we call agentic AI? Agentic meaning pretty much autonomous AI, AI that works in the background without human input. Um, where would somebody use this right now? One thing that we're seeing is that a bank might use this for a help desk. So we're seeing regional banks may not have to the cybersecurity budget that they once had, or with the economy as spongy as it is, they might need to cut, unfortunately, um, cut the work count. They might be sort of coerced into using an AI help desk, and that might unfortunately result in the loss of jobs. But this is how it might be used. And this is how sort of the protections are in place. So a Tennessee credit union uses a Gen AI tool called Zest AI to foster fair lending. The tool is kept separate from the rest of the models. That's sort of something that we see in the current regulation. And one thing I did want to touch on that Chris just mentioned about AI regulation. Some clients have had a question is, hey, like what regulation is going to be in place. We see the direction that, like, let's just say the FTC is going, is that they're going to try to follow these industry standard practices to sort of guide the regulations around. So NIST is a common one. National Institute for Standards and Technology comes out with standards pretty much surrounding anything technology related. That's sort of where we see a lot of regulatory bodies, such as the ones in the banking industry, going with regulations. And then this sort of industry use case is a perfect example of where we're seeing these AI efforts push towards and how it can be evolved. And then also another thing to touch on is AI tools when it comes to security. So a lot of security tools, let's just say, for example, CrowdStrike, Microsoft Security Copilot, DropZone, these tools are designed and actually AI powered to help you prevent the things that we were talking about earlier, phishing, smishing, all these different digital asset problems. And organizations can leverage these tools that don't have the resources or the capital to invest in a full-time security operations center team, and they're able to protect themselves based on the size of the organization, the information that they're dealing with. And it's important that we know and realize that, hey, some of these tools, and quite frankly, most of these tools in 2025 are actually artificially intelligent powered. This is why we can't have nice things, unfortunately, with any sort of new technology and new trend out there, um, it sort of has its ups and downs. Unfortunately, there's the good uses of it, but that's not going to come with the malicious uses. As we're sort of seeing here, there's a lot of things going around about deep fakes. People have been caught up in these multi-million-dollar fines and payouts with having to do with ransomware and such, having because they were deep faked. Um, that number, 80% of phishing ammos now incorporate AI. I just attended the Rochester Security Summit this past week, and this number is more like 90% now. Um, there are these hackers and these hacktivist groups that are targeting organizations are basically using free to use information and anything that they can get their hands on and crafting these super crafty emails. They're even figuring out how to get domain names. So you might even get an email from bonadio.com, but the last O is a zero, but it looks like an O because it's the way that they do the font. They're even getting that creative. And then the last thing, what should you do when you're using AI? What should you consider? What should you consider going into it? So the ones that we've bolded here are probably the most important to focus on and to put efforts towards. The first thing is defining the objectives and scope. What is your business goal, business use, business case? A perfect place to put that is within a policy. Um, how far do you want to go? Do you want to, hey, we're going to let our users and our employees use generative AI to help with documents and help with writing emails and such, but we're going to confine it within our own enterprise environment. That's a perfect example of where to start. Then you kind of go and jump into developing a strategy, your roadmap, how far, let's just say a 5-year plan of how far you want to take artificial intelligence. Where do you see yourself? How much money and resources and time do you want to allocate to it? And then once you start to develop this AI strategy and start to implement it, then you can kind of go back and say, okay, we need to define the risk and when information is going in and out of these tools. So we do an AI risk assessment, or we do an AI skills assessment where we benchmark this AI tool or AI generative AI agent to a certain standard. Some common ones include NIST AI risk management framework. A new one that I just discovered was OWASP AI. They have this top 10, which sort of shows what the top 10 risks are. That one's really cool. And ISO also has a nice industry standard AI risk management framework. Both of these have come out within the past year, so are super relevant to what is going on within the industry. And then you sort of bounce back and forth between, okay, we're going to select partners. It's important to kind of gauge and ensure that you are selecting vendors appropriately, and then ongoing, training. So it's maybe as part of your security awareness training within your organization, sort of, hey, we're going to train users on how to avoid phishing and how to not fall for text message scams. Now we're training them on how to identify artificially intelligent disinformation. We're teaching them how to deal with AI generated videos or emails and such. And with all the rest of these, this is sort of an ongoing thing within your organization to just keep considering.
Thanks, Don. All right, now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and for the remaining time, talk a little bit about, hey, what are some specific examples and areas in which organizations that we talk to are struggling with, and what are some things that keep popping up? So we'll go through all of these bullet points in detail, and I'll just kind of jump right into them. So the first one is governance and oversight, especially those that are in a heavily regulated space like financial services or healthcare, for example. There is an increasing amount of pressure for our governance team, specifically like our boards of directors, to have more of an understanding and a grasp on our cybersecurity activity, where the risks are, and what our organizations are doing about them. It's no longer acceptable to just have a simple report get stuffed in the back of a board packet that says, here's what's going on in our IT environment, and approve of those board minutes, right? I've seen multiple times with clients that I work with, they get kind of dinged on audits and regulatory exams because they just didn't do enough of a thorough job escalating and communicating to their boards exactly what's going on. And trust me, I understand that this is a delicate balance because we only have a certain amount of time and occurrences per year that we meet with our boards, and we can't just like overwhelm them with technical jargon. So finding that balance about getting key information to them exactly, in a timely manner is becoming increasingly important. And I see a lot of organizations kind of developing a strategy and changing this over time. And I attend a lot of conferences throughout the year, and at various conferences, a lot of board members attend them, and they're walking around, they're learning, they're networking, and one of the easiest ways to sort of gauge an organization's board cybersecurity, readiness is to just simply ask a board member, "Hey, what keeps you up at night?" Or what are your biggest threats? And their answer can kind of tell you a lot about that organization and kind of where they are. If they kind of tell me, hey, yeah, well, no, we got an IT guy. Yeah, we're good. Or, yeah, well, we get a report every year, whatever it is, it's in there. That's kind of a red flag to me that says, hey, this board isn't really getting the information that they need, or there's some gaps here. On the flip side of that, if that board member was to tell me, we got a lot of devices that are approaching end of operating life, we have to migrate them over. And then that kind of be like, oh yeah, that board member is briefed on what's going on. They know what their risks are. Or they might say, geez, we just have like a lot of users who keep falling for phishing scams. We've had a couple account takeovers within the past year, and we're trying to beef up our training programs. Okay, very good. Like they know their stuff. So that's always a good way to kind of get that gauge. And some examples down here below, some of the major cybersecurity attacks that have happened over the past couple of years that we've seen that have, made headlines have had board ramifications and implications involved in them, whether it's SolarWinds, MGM, or the First American breach a few years ago. There's a recurring theme that the board either was unaware of the issues that were going on, or they were kind of not really prepared to deal with them. And that's a major concern, right? In the case of SolarWinds, the SEC's like major lawsuit is against the board itself, saying you guys should have done a better job of preventing this from happening. There was a very, very clear lack of communication going on. So it kind of speaks to this ongoing challenge of not overwhelming our boards with information, but making sure we get to them exactly what is important and what we're doing about it. Another common issue and challenge is multi-factor authentication. And the reason it's a challenge is because of how ubiquitous and expected it is of organizations to have it in place. We've kind of arrived at the point, approaching 2026 now, where it is expected to have some sort of multi-factor authentication in place across the board. Not if you're logging in from home, or not if you're, out at a client, or, logging in remotely. No, if you're accessing sensitive documents, if you're logging in to our, crown jewels, you must have multi-factor authentication enabled. That's kind of where we're arriving at now. And there are multi-factor authentication methods that are stronger than others. Not all MFA is created equal, right? The weakest SMS and pins sent to our phones are considered weak because they are subject to being hacked too, especially if we're on the same network. Right, a lot of the common ones that we see are in this middle bucket here with app-based and push notifications. Dom talked about the risks of those. So we're trying to encourage clients to kind of adopt stronger, more encrypted methods of multi-factor authentication that are less susceptible to cyber attacks. End of operating life. So we just mentioned some of those instances, right? If you're on this call and maybe you're in the IT department and you are operating the Windows 10 classification for your servers, hey, that end of operating life is approaching tomorrow for your workstations. So make sure you have a plan in place to sort of transition over. And that's a difficult piece of end of operating life management, is making sure that there is adequate time to prepare a transition plan to upgrade to the newest version and models of support. A lot of times when we talk to clients and we kind of take a look at their inventory and we notice, hey, you've got a lot of Windows 10 devices on here, and oh, by the way, support's ending this month. What's your plan? And they'll say, well, yeah, no, we have a plan. Like, don't worry. But that kind of bleeds over into the next month and the month after that. And all of a sudden you have a lapse in time where you're susceptible to a cyber attack. A lot of the living off the land techniques that I just talked about that foreign, cyber groups are using takes advantage of that lapse in time that maybe an organization wasn't prepared to transition off of. And then so Dom mentioned vendor management, but it's worth repeating because of how critical of a control area it is. The more time that goes on, the more we outsource some critical functions of our day-to-day business to a third party, the more risk that we're introducing. And a common reason that an organization might not have their handle on their vendor risks is because they have an inadequate policy, or they haven't appropriately defined who their critical vendors are. And it always starts with asking yourself some key questions about your vendors so you can have a firm grasp on where your critical ones are. You'd also be surprised. Sometimes organizations are collecting, critical vendor due diligence documents for 100 vendors when they only actually have 5 of them, right? Why are you collecting, all of this information for someone who doesn't really even have access to your organization, or you don't share confidential information with? Well, it's because they didn't do a good job of classifying it up front. So asking yourself, hey, does this vendor have access to our sensitive information? Do we rely on them for our day-to-day business operations? Having those questions laid out in your policy that you can kind of use when you're onboarding a vendor is a good way to set yourself up for success. Of course, having risk assessments and due diligence on an ongoing basis for your vendors is sort of the gold standard here and is expected of our organizations, making sure we have an understanding of how well our vendors are doing at protecting not only their sensitive information, but our sensitive information, right? We should hold our vendors to the same standard that we hold ourselves to. And we can do that by collecting that SOC 2 report or by performing a risk assessment. How well is their training program? What do their policies look like? Do they have a business continuity plan in place? That's all questions that you run through, especially on your critical vendors, on an annual basis. And then finally, this fourth party, kind of note down here is becoming increasingly important. Your vendors. Yeah, we now have to start thinking about, vendors that are further down the line. So like that Microsoft, for example, that example that Dom mentioned earlier in the presentation is going to be important. We don't necessarily have to sort of do the same due diligence for our fourth parties as we do for our critical vendors, but it might be worth asking your critical vendors, how well are they performing their own vendor due diligence? Do they know who their critical vendors are? And are they confident that they're collecting the same due diligence information that you are of them? If they are kind of not giving you the answer that you're looking for, you might kind of increase that risk of that relationship that you have with your vendor right there. And so a couple more here, logging and detection tools. Having adequate and sufficient logging and monitoring tools in place is a great way to prevent cyber attacks from happening if somebody were to break into your perimeter. Having them properly configured so that you can detect suspicious activity goes a long way. A lot of times we see a sort of plug and play mentality when it comes to logging and monitoring tools. You kind of take a product off the shelf like a Microsoft Trend Micro or a Sentinel-1, and just sort of use the default out of the box configurations that it comes with. That can kind of cause, some issues if it's not configured properly to look for things that you are suspicious about. Sometimes someone can get in and remain undetected if those logging and monitoring tools are not fine-tuned enough. Another thing is the volume of data. There's a lot of alerts, a lot of information that comes from these tools. And sometimes if it's configured to not give us only the critical information that we're looking for, we can be overwhelmed and things can slip through the cracks. So as an example, to kind of wrap this up, Patelco Credit Union is a large financial institution out in California, and a good case study that kind of incorporates all of these control areas that we just talked about into one data breach right here. Last year, they suffered a ransomware attack where they were down for 2 weeks. People did not know if their money was gone. They couldn't access their accounts. They were literally pulling cash out of the ATMs because they thought that their money was gone. They didn't know. They weren't receiving any communication from Patelco at the time. And, come to find out what we've learned about this particular data breach was that somebody fell for a phishing scam, which we just talked about. Somehow MFA was either bypassed or was non-existent. Then somebody got on the network and remained undetected for an entire month before they launched their ransomware attack. So what does that tell us? Logging and detection tools were either non-existent or misconfigured. So that user was there, got in, bypassed security controls, sat there, went undetected, and then launched a ransomware attack, which took down the entire network for 2 weeks. Kind of speaks to the combination of the controls that we need to have in place that we need to just ask ourselves about so that we can kind of prevent these types of attacks from happening. All right. Some last minute questions. So if you're heading back to your teams and you're curious about some of the things that we've talked about, what are some questions that you might be able to ask? And these are just high level, easy to digest and talk about with your management team or your colleagues. The first one is training. Hey, when was the last time we did cybersecurity training? Are we documenting our training programs, and how often are we engaging the use of outside or internal experts to sort of make sure our training program looks good and is incorporating emerging threats like AI, like Dom talked about? A risk assessment. Hey, where are our gaps? When's the last time we talked when's the last time we conducted a risk assessment, and did we use an outside third party? Governance and oversight. Is there a dedicated individual to oversee our information security program? And also, does our board receive regular cybersecurity updates and training? And then lastly here, 3 more, critical vendors. Do we have a vendor due diligence process? And is that process adequately documented? When was this last due diligence conducted? Vulnerability and threat intelligence. Hey, do we know what our critical vulnerabilities are? Are we leveraging resources that are free and available to us to let us know when critical vulnerabilities are identified? There are a lot of great government-backed websites such as CISA, such as FS-ISAC, for example, that can kind of relay information to you if you have a small team about threats that are going on. Have you conducted an internal or external penetration test? That's a great way to find out where your holes are in your external and internal perimeter security. And then artificial intelligence. If there's one question to just ask your team, hey, do we have an AI policy? Have we conducted a risk assessment? What is our strategy here? Are we going to sort of, put a stake in the ground and say we're not using AI? Or are we kind of saying, let's move forward with this, but do we have a policy in place? Do we have a grasp around what we want our AI programs to look like? So we're right at 12 o'clock. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. We'd be happy to answer any questions at this time. Please feel free to reach out to Dom or I with any thoughts, feedback, or questions that you might have. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you attend some sessions throughout the remainder of the week. Thank you so much for your time. Just going to take a quick look at the chat, see if any remaining questions came in. Okay, so we do have one from Jeff. How does a small IT security team handle or defend from these threats while on a tight budget? That's a good question. I would first suggest that you do an internal self-gap assessment to sort of see where your holes are. Do you have any gaps? Do you have tools in place to sort of stay on top of them with what you have? And if you don't, you're on a tight budget, you might consider some emerging tools like the AI Security Copilot tool that Don mentioned is a great way to sort of help you stay on top of vulnerabilities, attacks, without, this major IT team at your disposal. So, hey, some of the new emerging AI tools might be something to consider. So thank you, everyone. We'll stay on for a couple minutes to see if any last remaining questions come in. So a couple more questions coming in. Does compliant equal security? Not always. Oh, that's a great question, and it's a constant balance of, how much do we invest in just checking the box and being compliant with a standard or a law, and how secure are we actually? I would say a good way to test does being compliant equal security is the third party audit, a pen test, or a gap assessment, right? A pen test will pretty much tell you in a yes or no answer how secure you actually are. It will test the actual things that you might attest against and comply with, versus having someone actually try to break into your organization. And Dom, we have a question for you. You mentioned NIST and other organizations. I think you were referring to OWASP.
OWASP, that is correct. Yeah. So OWASP is an organization that is mostly targeting organizations susceptible to red teamers, so having to do with offensive security. So OWASP has a nice large language model framework having to do with the top 10 risks to AI chatbots and AI agents. I will quickly find that on Google and link it in the chat.
It's like Jeff helped us out. Thank you. Another question, should organizations be prepared for quote post-quantum threats? Tom, you kind of handled that side.
Yeah.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so it's one of those things. Quantum computing is one of those sort of things, sort of like AI, where for the early 2010s to 2020s, it was sort of kept under wraps. So quantum computing is one of those things that we're pretty unsure about. How long is it going to take for these quantum threats to sort of come to light? How long, how much should we worry about it? Organizations should at least have conversations around it, especially for smaller organizations. It's one of those things where the resources just aren't there yet. but there definitely should be some conversation at a high level of, okay, when the technology begins to emerge, when it becomes to come out, what are we going to do about it? There's a lot of free resources out there that talk about these threats that continuously update themselves. NIST, again, one of those things that NIST has a quantum release, where they talk about, these are the threats that could possibly emerge. A lot of what I talked about today is relatively theoretical. There are some things in practice, such as the RIT network. There are quantum computers that are in existence. As I explained, they're mostly at universities and have to be kept at like negative 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's not a lot of use cases for them yet, but there at least should be a conversation around it. Yes.
Thank you. And then we had another question from Barb about what do you do if a vendor doesn't respond to you regarding their use of AI? That's a great question, a common one that we get. The thing that you definitely should do is note their reluctancy or their avoidance with disclosing their AI use to you in your annual risk assessments. If a vendor is not providing you the answer to that question, that's a red flag, and you should increase the risk of that vendor relationship and at least make note of it and report it to your board, right? That's a perfect example of communicating to your board members some issues you might be having or some cyber risks that might be present with your vendors. And then, practically after the fact, we should be updating your contracts to sort of require disclosure about it to give you some leverage, to stand on to say, hey, we need to know if you're using AI. In my view, if a vendor is not providing you or not disclosing you their AI practices, that's a red flag. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that they need to sort of disclose their proprietary models or their IP, but they should offer you some comfort that your sensitive information is safe or it's not flowing through their AI models at all. So I think if you're having issues, you definitely should note the risk there. Make sure your board knows about it. And then when you re-up with this vendor or you're going through contract negotiations again, I would definitely try to include some language in there that requires it. How often should organizations evaluate their associated third-party vendors? So critical ones we recommend at least on an annual basis. Right within your policy, depending on the criticality and risk classification of a particular vendor, you will then define how often you're going to conduct that due diligence. So again, if it's that critical tier one vendor that has access to your confidential information or provides a critical day-to-day service for you, you should have right in that same policy, we're going to review their due diligence documentation on an annual basis. Then you go down a tier, maybe to a tier two or high risk vendor that might have some access, but they don't necessarily provide that day-to-day critical function for you. Hey, we're going to look at them every other year. And then you kind of go down a tier, I mean, you could do tertiary vendors where you do every third year, for example. But for those critical tier one vendors that you've defined, definitely at least on an annual basis. All right. Well, thank you for the great questions. This was an awesome, engaging conversation. If there are no else, I think we'll hop off for this session, but please feel free to connect with us if you'd like to further the discussion. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you on some subsequent sessions throughout the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.